Africa has been the provider. If you look at Europe, Europe cannot survive without Africa. One situation that people don't realize, post-World War, when the US came up with the Marshall Plan, what they don't tell you is that the contribution through exploitation of African minerals was actually the biggest funder of the European Recovery Plan, ERP, aka the Marshall Plan. US contributed $13 billion, which is now present day $175 billion, which, by the way, the American taxpayer must be paid back. Nobody's asking for that money back. But what they don't tell you is that Africa, through exploitation of its resources by the Europeans, was actually a much, much bigger contribution to the European recovery post-World War II. Nobody talks about that. Why does such a continent that did so much to help Europe recover continue to be so poor?
When people hear the name Nelson Mandela, they think of freedom, reconciliation, and progress.
Would you want a Gaddafi or an Arafat or a Castro to be a future president of South Africa?
One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies.
But what about Robert Mugabe? While Mandela is celebrated as a global hero, an icon, Mugabe is often remembered as a dictator who ruled Zimbabwe with an iron fist. But here's the twist.
May I say, people must always come first in any process of sustainable development. And let our Africans come first in the development of Africa, not as puppets, not as beggars, but as a sovereign people. I thank you.
In the 1980s and early 90s, Mugabe's policies actually transformed Zimbabwe into one of Africa's most promising nations. Let's take a closer look at that legacy. When Mugabe came into power in 1980, after the Liberation War, Zimbabwe was a divided nation. His first policies shocked the world, not with brutality, but with generosity. The education revolution. Mugabe introduced free primary education, abolished segregation, and massively expanded schools. Enrollment skyrocketed. By the mid-1980s, Zimbabwe had one of the highest literacy rates in Africa. Healthcare expansion. He built clinics and hospitals in rural areas, made basic healthcare free, and trained thousands of nurses and doctors. Infant mortality dropped, life expectancy rose, and ordinary families felt the difference. From 1985 to 1990, Mugabe's government didn't just stop at schools and hospitals. It also challenged long-standing social inequalities. Women's rights. The Legal Age of Majority Act of 1982 gave women legal independence for the first time. More women could own property, enter contracts, and pursue education. In terms of land reform, the first phase, under the Willing Buyer, Willing Seller program, some white-owned farms were redistributed to black Zimbabweans, though on a smaller scale than expected. The late 1980s. By the late 1980s, Zimbabwe's economy was thriving. Agriculture and mining exports boomed, and the nation earned the nickname the breadbasket of Africa. The gross domestic product growth reached 5 to 7% in certain years, Roads, electricity, and clean water systems expanded into rural areas. Zimbabwe gained respect as a stable, modernizing African nation. But by the early 90s, cracks began to show. Facing debt and global pressure, Mugabe accepted the IMF's Economic Structural Adjustment Program. The IMF, or the International Monetary Fund's interventions in Africa, have often had destabilizing effects on economic growth. Many critics argue that the destabilizing effects of IMF policies in Africa are often aligned with Western economic interests. Structural adjustment programs forced countries to devalue currencies, privatize state-owned enterprises, and remove trade barriers, which frequently benefited Western corporations seeking cheap access to African resources. An example is Zambia, another Ghana. Mining, cocoa, and timber sectors were open to foreign investors while local industries struggled to compete. They devalued currencies, which made exports cheaper for global buyers and raised the cost of imported goods for ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, cuts to social spending sparked unrest and weakened governments, creating conditions where multinational corporations could negotiate favorable deals in effect. These policies often prioritized external economic interests over local development and human welfare. In short, these policies often put Western profit ahead of African development, creating a cycle of dependency and economic struggle. In the 1980s and 1990s, countries like Zambia, Ghana, and Zimbabwe adopted these International Monetary Fund-backed structural adjustment programs to manage debt crises. These programs required drastic cuts to their government spending, removal of food and fuel subsidies for their populace, and privatization of state-owned enterprises. While the policies were intended to stabilize national budgets and attract foreign investment, so they said, they frequently undermined social welfare and development, directly destabilizing these economies. In Zambia, subsidy removals led to sharp increases in food prices, sparking strikes and political unrest. In Zimbabwe, the International Monetary Fund austerity measures coincided with rising unemployment and declining public services, particularly in healthcare and education, destabilizing the country. Overall, these interventions often prioritized macroeconomic indicators over human development, leaving populations poorer and more vulnerable despite temporary fiscal stability, which works in line with the interest of Western nations. So in Zimbabwe, in line with the intervention of the International Monetary Fund, many Zimbabweans lost work prospects, poverty deepened, and some of the earlier progress was actually reversed. Yet still throughout the 1980s, Zimbabwe's education and health systems remained among the strongest in Africa. So here's the reality. Mugabe's early years in power weren't just about authoritarian rule. They were also about building a foundation for Zimbabwe. Schools, clinics, and rural development expanded like never before. But by the 1990s, external forces began to undermine these gains. The International Monetary Fund backed structural adjustment programs that forced austerity, privatization, and currency devaluation. Policies that benefited Western corporations and investors while crushing local industries and cutting vital social services. Ordinary Zimbabweans suffered and faced rising prices, unemployment, and weakened healthcare and education systems. In other words, Zimbabwe's later economic collapse wasn't solely Mugabe's fault. It was also shaped by global economic pressures designed to extract wealth from Africa, leaving the nation struggling despite its early promise. This has happened all over Africa. The story of Zimbabwe in the 1980s and 1990s is a complex one. A nation that once held great potential, undermined by a mix of domestic and international forces. Understanding this context changes how we now view Mugabe's legacy and the lessons for Africa today.
Let's be realistic here. Let's not talk about peanuts. Africa does not need the aid. What we need is for those who are exploiting Africa to stop. Africa has everything it needs. If Africa could have contributed as much as it did to the recovery of Europe post-World War II, why wasn't Africa equally developed? This is a wake-up call to the African leaders to take inventory of what is really happening in their countries. Do they really need the peanuts that are coming in as aid?
Thank you for giving me your precious time and attention. Before I forget, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel.